Hi everyone, part 3 of the revision lecture. Remember, just me and an iPhone, no camera stand, so if this is the first part you're watching, you should probably go back and watch part 1 and 2. Part 3 is going to look at the Cuban Revolution and the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban Missile Crisis and the consequences of that, and then also the Prague Spring. Remember, you should not just use this lecture as your only source of revision. Use the PowerPoint slides that I'm going to put with this on Share My Homework so you can follow along because they're on the table in front of me, and they will help because there's some really good pictures there and maps, etc. Also, you must be using your revision guides, your exercise books to revise these events in more detail. I can't possibly tell you everything just using my iPhone. So, to begin with then, slide 14 and the Cuban Revolution. You'll see on that map, Cuba is situated right next to the USA. Cuba and the USA had been together, if you like, for quite a long time. Probably more on America's terms, if I'm honest. Cuba has lots to offer for America. Tobacco, rum, sugar, lots of things that they can use and trade. Cuba kind of felt exploited from America for a long time, and they'd kind of had enough. And they had their own communist revolution led by Fidel Castro, who started appointing communists in the government. And he made agreement with Khrushchev to buy sugar from Cuba, which sent alarm bells out to America because clearly, and if you look at the map, you'll see why, having a country on your doorstep who are friends with the Soviet Union would put America's own security at risk. Cuba also then were told that they would receive arms and weapons from the USSR. So this was a huge issue. Kennedy, the new American president, had to respond. He could not allow communists to be on the doorstep. They were absolutely petrified of the communists in America. But he also couldn't invade Cuba himself because that would seem aggressive and seem that America was trying to kind of, again, take over the world. So in secret, the CIA organised with 1,400 Cuban exiles. They are people who'd fled Cuba in this communist revolution, their own invasion. And the idea was that these Cuban exiles would invade, and it would appear that America would have nothing to do with it. However, the invasion failed because plans were kind of unveiled, and they were met by 20,000 Cuban soldiers. Not only did the invasion fail, but it seemed that the Cuban exiles were armed with weapons from the Americans. And it was a huge embarrassment to JFK because it was almost impossible for him to deny that the Bay of Pigs invasion was not something which was planned and supported by the USA. So it put him in a spot of bother because, again, Khrushchev seems to have the upper hand, and JFK, in his first test as American president, he'd had a defeat. Which led then to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuba wanted protection. The Bay of Pigs had shown that they were vulnerable to attack from America. So the Soviet Union agreed that they would put nuclear weapons in Cuba. I suppose as well for the Soviet Union, they wanted to give themselves what we call a first strike option. They wanted to be able to fire their nuclear missiles into America first, rather than reacting to an attack by the Americans. And it's important to note at this point, America already had their own nuclear missiles in Turkey, which is on the doorstep of the Soviet Union. So in theory, you could say that the Soviet Union were just trying to balance the power, if you like. But nonetheless, Khrushchev felt he had the upper hand because of the Bay of Pigs invasion, and he thought that he would test Kennedy. Remember, you will have to look at the Cuban Missile Crisis in more detail in your revision guides or your exercise books. But essentially, this played out over a period of what we call 13 days, where President Kennedy set up ExComm, a committee made up of two sides, the Hawks and the Doves. The Hawks wanting to use military intervention in Cuba and destroy the missile sites, and the Doves who wanted more peaceful methods. And they ended up going for a blockade around Cuba. And basically, they said if the ships that had set sail from the USSR with nuclear weapons made it to Cuba and went past that blockade, America would respond in force. And in that 13 days, tensions were at an all-time high. arguably one of the most tense points of the Cold War itself. There was a U-2 spy plane which was shot down over Cuba, and that caused even more tension. And to cut a long story short, Khrushchev eventually sent a telegram to Kennedy, and he offered to remove the missiles from Cuba, or sorry, not take them to Cuba, if the USA removed the missiles from Turkey. At which America initially said no, but eventually they agreed kind of to do it, but in secret, so the American people would never find out. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a realisation for both sides that it couldn't really carry on like this. They were so close to nuclear war. There were people in each country desperate for nuclear war. But I suppose what it also showed is JFK and Khrushchev, when it really came down to it, knew that nuclear war was not an option, because it would have been mutually assured destruction, known as MAD. So the consequences of the Cuban Missile Crisis were actually relatively positive. There was a telephone hotline built in 1963 to improve communications and stop misjudgments. I haven't mentioned misjudgments much in this lecture, but I suppose misjudgments are where each side misjudges or misinterprets the other side's actions. And I suppose that hotline being there meant each president could talk to each other directly rather than listening to their advisors and potentially making some bad decisions. There was also the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963, which banned the testing of nuclear weapons, the first steps to kind of reducing the amount of weapons each country had. The Outer Space Treaty in 1967, where they wouldn't use space for military purposes, something which America eventually bypassed when they used the SDI or the Star Wars kind of tactics under Reagan later on. There's also the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968, where they agreed to stop spreading nuclear weapons to other countries. So, for example, America wouldn't give any of their nuclear weapons to other countries in the West. So the consequences seemed generally pretty good. That's between the two sides anyway. But I suppose if we're going on to slide 18, the Prague Spring is kind of an example really where tensions were still not great within the communist bloc. Now, don't be too put off by the name of the Prague Spring when you're revising this. Prague is the capital of Czechoslovakia, and this happened in the spring, which is why it's called the Prague Spring. Well, that's what I think anyway. Czechoslovakia, if you remember, is in the Eastern Bloc. But importantly to note, this is the country that was taken over by a military coup, which meant they were forced to become a communist country in the first place. So clearly there's going to be people in Czechoslovakia who would not be happy with that. And in 1968, the people were kind of fed up. They were fed up that communism took away their freedom of speech. They were fed up that they weren't allowed to prosper. There was poverty. There were food shortages. There was a lack of fuel, etc. And Dubček was elected the head of the Czech government. And again, he was someone who had a relatively good relationship with Khrushchev. And it was also important to note that he was a communist. He didn't want to leave the Warsaw Pact or end Czechoslovakia as a communist nation. He just wanted to make it better. So the Prague Spring was where he brought in a series of reforms, of which he called socialism with a human face. He wanted, some more freedom of speech. He wanted people to be able to speak out against the government if they were unhappy. He wanted some kind of small, kind of capitalist-style measures to try and, get the economy flowing a little bit more. There's a new Soviet leader at this time. Khrushchev was gone and he was replaced by Brezhnev. And Brezhnev, once again, as the new leader, was under pressure to act. Khrushchev, I suppose, was embarrassed at the Cuban Missile Crisis because he was forced to turn his boats around. Brezhnev couldn't really afford his own defeat. Also, worryingly, I suppose for Brezhnev as well, Romania and Yugoslavia were also in support of Dubček's ideas. And they themselves liked this idea of socialism with a human face. Basically, kind of communism, but not as harsh. That's what they were thinking. So Brezhnev, rather than invading straight away, he orders Warsaw Pact troops to kind of carry out manoeuvres and operations in Czechoslovakia, just outside of Prague, basically to threaten Dubček and the Czech people. But by August 1948, the Warsaw Pact troops invade. Now, the textbook said something like 500,000 troops, which I think that's mental. I can't imagine it'd be that many people. Like, that is so many people. So I'd be happy with you saying that the Warsaw troops invaded. But I suppose the main thing that you need to know there is that Dubek was arrested and replaced with a new leader. But this led to September 1968 and the Brezhnev Doctrine. And this is where Brezhnev set out that if any communist country or any country within the Warsaw Pact tried to uprise or move against or go against communism, it was the responsibility of the other communist nations in that Eastern Bloc to stop that from happening. I suppose kind of like his own version of the Truman Doctrine, if you like. Again, he wouldn't see that necessarily as an aggressive policy against America. It's not really an expansive policy, but what it's certainly doing is setting out that he has no intention of allowing these Eastern European countries to leave the Warsaw Pact and to keep that buffer zone strong. So again, that's the next part. I suppose the one thing I would say, which I haven't said in this lecture yet, is you've got plenty of different topics there, which I think you would certainly be asked a narrative account about. I think the Prague Spring would be an opportunity for a narrative account question in your exam. I certainly think the Cuban Missile Crisis or the Bay of Pigs, I couldn't imagine them being asked together, but who knows with this exam. But they're certainly questions to practice. I think the Berlin Crisis, both of them, you could be asked a narrative account, a question on. Certainly the Hungarian Uprising, and maybe the satellite states at the beginning as well. With your narrative account, remember, it's important that you, when you revise the topics, you think of having 5 or maybe 6 different points which are kind of in sequence or in chronological order. And then you show your knowledge of those events, but you don't just tell it as a story. You show your understanding of what happened and maybe why decisions were made, and use the process and linking phrases which are in your book to help connect them together. So, for example, with the Prague Spring, you would want to be saying things that like the reasons that it happened is because Czechoslovakia was taken over by a military coup in 1948. The people were fed up and they were unhappy with the situation they were forced to live in. Making sure that you're explaining clearly that Dubek was a communist, but he wanted to make these reforms. Brezhnev realised he had to act because of previous failures of the communists, particularly the Cuban Missile Crisis. So you're showing your understanding of those events, but kind of not just the event itself, but also the bigger picture and what's going on at the time. You know, America realising they can't join in with the Hungarian uprising because they know that by that stage the Soviet Union have a nuclear bomb. You know, little things like that are really important. And I suppose that's what you need to be practicing if you attempt any practice narrative account questions before your exam. Okay, so that's part 3 over. 2 more parts to go. Hopefully you're still with me at this point. Okay, thank you.